Picture this: a lone wooden ship, battered by waves, adrift in an endless expanse of ocean. The crew clings to the deck, their faces etched with exhaustion and fear. The horizon offers no landmarks, no signs of land, just the relentless sway of the sea. This was the reality for medieval sailors, venturing into the unknown with nothing but the stars, the wind, and their wits to guide them. How did they do it? How did they cross thousands of miles of open water, facing storms, starvation, and the ever-present threat of vanishing into the abyss, without the maps or instruments we take for granted today? The answer lies in a world of hidden knowledge, where nature itself became a compass, and the secrets of the ancients were passed down like sacred whispers. This is the story of medieval navigation, a dazzling blend of intuition, innovation, and sheer bravery. Sailors didn't just stumble blindly into the dark. They mastered the art of reading the sky, the waves, even the flight of birds. They carried tools that seem primitive to us now, but were revolutionary in their time, tools that could chart a course across the unknown with startling accuracy. But here's the thing: much of this knowledge was guarded closely, a mix of science and superstition, practical skill and mystical tradition. Some techniques were so effective, they remained in use for centuries, long after the medieval era faded into history. So what were these secrets? How did sailors navigate with no GPS, no satellites, not even a reliable clock? That's exactly what we're about to uncover. From the mysterious Viking sunstones that could locate the sun on a cloudy day, to the intricate astrolabes that mapped the heavens, we'll dive into the ingenious methods that turned the impossible into routine. This isn't just a tale of survival, it's a testament to human ingenuity, to the relentless curiosity that drove explorers to push beyond the edges of the known world. And by the end of this journey, you'll see the ocean through their eyes, not as a barrier, but as a pathway to wonders waiting to be discovered. So let's set sail into the past. To cross an ocean in the Middle Ages was to dance with uncertainty at every turn. Imagine setting sail without a single accurate map. Charts of the time were often crude sketches filled with monsters at the edges and guesses in between. The world was still being pieced together, and sailors had to trust their lives to half-remembered coastlines and rumors of distant lands. Worse still, the weather was a constant wild card. One day, calm seas and favorable winds could speed a ship forward. The next, a tempest might blow it hundreds of miles off course with no way to recalculate. In an age before satellite forecasts or even reliable compasses, every voyage was a gamble against nature's whims, yet sailors didn't resign themselves to luck. They turned navigation into a meticulous craft, blending sharp observation with hard-won wisdom. Take something as simple as the sun without clocks. Medieval mariners learned to gauge time and direction by its arc across the sky. At noon, when the sun reached its highest point, they could estimate latitude by measuring its angle with their hands or basic tools. At night, the stars became their guides. Polaris, the North Star, was especially crucial. Fixed in the northern sky, it offered a steady reference point in the chaos of open water. But these methods demanded more than just knowledge, they required intuition. A seasoned sailor could read the color of the waves, the shift in wind patterns, even the behavior of birds to sense land long before it appeared on the horizon. And then there were the tools crude by modern standards but revolutionary for their time. The magnetic compass, though rare early on, slowly became a lifeline, its needle pointing faithfully north even when clouds hid the stars. The astrolabe, borrowed from Islamic astronomers, allowed sailors to measure the sun's height above the horizon with surprising precision. But perhaps most fascinating were the tricks passed down through generations. Viking navigators, for instance, used thin slices of crystal called sunstones. On overcast days when the sun was invisible, these stones could polarize light, revealing its hidden position like a secret message from the sky. What's striking isn't just that these methods worked, it's how deeply they intertwined science with the rhythms of nature. Medieval navigation wasn't about conquering the sea, it was about learning to listen to it. Every gust of wind, every shift in current told a story. Misreading those signs could mean disaster, but mastering them, that meant unlocking the world. Among the countless challenges medieval sailors faced, perhaps none was more daunting than the sheer emptiness of the open ocean. With no landmarks, no roads, and no signs to follow, they turned their gaze upward, to the only constants in their shifting world, the stars. The night sky wasn't just a spectacle, it was a map, a clock, and a compass all in one. Polaris, the North Star, became their anchor. Unlike other stars that wheeled across the heavens as the night progressed, Polaris held its place, fixed almost directly above Earth's northern axis. For sailors in the northern hemisphere, this was a gift of cosmic symmetry. By measuring the angle between Polaris and the horizon, sometimes with nothing more than their outstretched fingers, they could estimate their latitude, knowing roughly how far north or south they'd traveled. But celestial navigation wasn't just about a single star. The sun played an equally vital role during the day. At noon, when it reached its highest point, sailors used simple tools like the quadrant or cross staff to measure its angle. A higher sun meant they were closer to the equator, a lower one signaled they were nearing northern or southern waters. Even the moon had its uses. Its phases helped track the passage of weeks, while its position relative to certain stars could offer rough bearings when clouds obscured Polaris. And then there were the constellations Ursa Major, Cassiopeia, Orion, whose familiar patterns acted as celestial signposts, helping navigators orient themselves when other references faded. What's remarkable is how sailors adapted these techniques across cultures and centuries. Viking navigators, for instance, combined star lore with an intimate knowledge of sea currents and bird migrations. Arab traders, masters of the Indian Ocean, refined the astrolabe into a precision instrument capable of calculating latitude even on rolling decks. And in the Pacific, Polynesian voyagers memorized the rising and setting points of hundreds of stars, creating mental maps so precise they could pinpoint tiny islands across thousands of miles of open water. Yet for all its elegance, celestial navigation demanded more than just technical skill. It required patience, intuition, and a deep connection to the natural world. A cloudy night could leave a ship directionless for days. A misjudged angle might send it spiraling off course, but when the skies were clear and the stars aligned, these ancient mariners achieved something extraordinary. They turned the vast, trackless ocean into a highway guided by the very lights of heaven. The astrolabe might look like an intricate piece of ancient jewelry at first glance, a brass disc etched with delicate curves and cryptic markings. But in the hands of a skilled navigator, it was nothing short of revolutionary. Imagine holding a handheld model of the universe, a device that could translate the dizzying movements of stars into a precise readout of your position on Earth. At its core, the astrolabe worked by measuring the angle between a celestial body, usually the sun or a bright star, and the horizon. By aligning the movable components with the observed height of the sun at noon, sailors could calculate their latitude with surprising accuracy, often within a few dozen miles. Its origins trace back to the golden age of Islamic science, where scholars refined earlier Greek designs into something far more sophisticated. By the 8th century, Muslim astronomers had perfected the astrolabe, using it not just for navigation but for timekeeping, prayer schedules, and even astrology. The device spread to Europe through cultural crossroads like Spain and Sicily, where Christian and Muslim scholars exchanged knowledge. When European explorers began venturing into the Atlantic, they quickly realized the astrolabe's potential. Portuguese navigators, in particular, relied on it during their pioneering voyages down the African coast, where shifting coastlines and unfamiliar stars made traditional methods useless. But mastering the astrolabe wasn't for the faint of heart. Using it on a rocking ship required steady hands and sharper eyes. mariners had to wait for calm seas or risk miscalculating their angle by a critical degree. Some versions, like the mariner's Astrolabe, were simplified for rough conditions, heavier, with weighted rings to minimize sway, yet even then it demanded patience. A single reading could take minutes, with the navigator squinting against glare and spray, adjusting the alidade, the sighting arm, until the sun's rays pierced precisely through its tiny holes. What's fascinating is how the Astrolabe bridged worlds. It was a tool of scholars and sailors, of mathematicians and merchants. In the Islamic world, it symbolized the harmony of science and faith, used to determine the direction of Mecca or the timing of Ramadan. In Europe, it became a weapon of exploration, enabling voyages that reshaped the map. And while later inventions like the sextant would eventually surpass it, the Astrolabe's legacy endures, a testament to human curiosity and to the timeless urge to navigate not just the seas but the heavens themselves. While the Astrolabe was a marvel of medieval engineering, its complexity made it impractical for everyday use at sea, especially when time and stability were in short supply. Enter the quadrant, a tool so straightforward in design yet so powerful in function that it became the go-to instrument for sailors who needed quick, reliable readings. Picture a quarter circle of wood or brass, marked with degree lines along its curved edge and fitted with a weighted plumb line. To use it, a navigator would simply align one edge with the sun or a star, then let gravity do the rest. The plumb line would hang straight down, crossing the scale at the exact angle of the celestial body above the horizon. In just moments, without intricate adjustments or delicate parts, the sailor had their latitude. Compared to the Astrolabe, the quadrant was rugged, fast, and forgiving. Where the Astrolabe demanded calm waters and careful handling, the quadrant could be used even on a heaving deck, its plumb line compensating for the ship's movement. This speed was crucial in the chaos of open water, where clouds could obscure the sun at any moment or a sudden squall might force the crew below decks. Portuguese explorers venturing down the coast of Africa in the 15th century relied heavily on quadrants for this very reason. Bartholomew Dias, who famously rounded the Cape of Good Hope, likely carried one on his voyages, trusting its simplicity when every second counted. But the quadrant wasn't just a backup for the Astrolabe, it excelled in its own right. Some versions, like the Quadrans Vetus, included extra markings to calculate time or even the height of tides. Others were small enough to fit in a pocket, making them indispensable for merchants and pirates alike. And while it couldn't match the Astrolabe's versatility for complex astronomical calculations, that wasn't the point. The quadrant was built for one job, measuring angles, and it did that job brilliantly. What's striking is how these tools complemented each other. The Astrolabe, with its intricate plates and celestial maps, was the scholar's instrument, perfect for planning voyages or teaching navigation. The quadrant was the sailor's workhorse, worn smooth by salt and hands, always ready when the sky cleared just long enough to take a reading. Together, they embodied the pragmatism of medieval navigation, a blend of high science and hard-won practicality, turning the vast, unknowable sea into something a little less terrifying. Dead reckoning was the medieval sailor's ultimate gamble, a high-stakes game of intuition and guesswork where one wrong calculation could mean disaster. Without landmarks or celestial guides on cloudy days, navigators relied on tracking their ship's speed, direction, and time traveled to estimate their position. They'd mark a starting point on their crude charts, then plot each day's progress based on how fast they thought they were moving and the compass bearing they'd held. It sounds simple, but the sea had a way of twisting even the best-laid plans. A strong current could silently drag a ship miles off course. Winds might shift unnoticed in the night, turning what should have been a straight path into a wandering spiral. And speed, that was often a rough guess, measured by tossing a log overboard and counting how quickly it passed the hull, a method as prone to error as the ocean was to deception. Yet for all its risks, dead reckoning was sometimes the only option. Take the legendary voyage of Leif Erikson, who supposedly reached North America around the year 1000. With no charts of the Atlantic and skies often shrouded in fog, Erikson and his crew would have depended entirely on dead reckoning, using the sun's occasional glimpses and the feel of the wind to guide them. Centuries later, Christopher Columbus faced the same challenge. His famous journey in 1492 relied heavily on dead reckoning, especially after his crew grew uneasy from weeks without sighting land. His calculations were off by thousands of miles. He believed he'd reached Asia, not the Caribbean, but the method got him across the ocean alive. But when dead reckoning failed, the consequences were dire. The Spanish treasure fleet of 1712 misjudged their position in the Florida Straits, blundering into a hurricane that wrecked 11 ships and sent tons of silver to the seabed. Even experienced navigators like Admiral Sir Cloudesley Shovel weren't immune. In 1707, his entire fleet ran aground off the Isles of Scilly after weeks of dead reckoning errors compounded by stormy weather. 4 ships and nearly 2,000 men were lost in a single night, all because an unseen current had pulled them silently off course. What's remarkable isn't just the risk sailors took, it's how often dead reckoning worked. Polynesian navigators crossed the vast Pacific by memorizing wave patterns and bird flights, adjusting their course mentally without written records. Arab traders in the Indian Ocean perfected the camel, a simple wooden card that measured star heights to correct their dead reckoning estimates. These methods were imperfect, yes, but they reveal something profound about medieval navigation. It wasn't just about tools or stars. It was about adaptability, about stitching together fragments of knowledge to conquer the impossible. Dead reckoning was less a science than an art, one that demanded courage, creativity, and a willingness to trust the untrustworthy sea. While celestial tools and dead reckoning guided sailors across open waters, navigating coastlines demanded something equally ingenious: maps that transformed vague shorelines into precise, actionable guides. Enter portolan charts, the medieval equivalent of GPS for coastal navigation. Unlike the fanciful medieval world maps cluttered with mythical creatures and biblical landmarks, portolan charts were ruthlessly practical. Drawn on vellum or sheepskin, these maps focused exclusively on coastlines, ports, and hazards, with an accuracy that still astonishes historians today. The open seas often left blank, save for a web of crisscrossing lines radiating from compass roses like spokes on a wheel. These were room lines, the secret to plotting a straight course in an era before longitude could be measured. The beauty of portolan charts lay in their detail. Harbors were drawn with meticulous care, their entrances marked by tiny towers or flags. Shallow banks and reefs appeared as clusters of dots, warning sailors of hidden dangers. But the true masterstroke was the compass rose, usually painted in vivid red, blue, and gold. Each rose served as the anchor point for those room lines, which ran in 32 directions corresponding to the compass winds. A sailor could draw a line from their current port to their destination, then follow that bearing until land appeared. It was a system so effective that some charts, like the famous Carta Pisana from the late 13th century, remained in use for centuries. What's remarkable is how these charts were made. Without satellites or aerial surveys, medieval cartographers relied on centuries of accumulated knowledge: logs from sailors, sketches by merchants, even intelligence gathered from fishermen. The result was a collaborative masterpiece where every curve of a bay or placement of a lighthouse was verified by countless voyages. The Mediterranean, with its bustling trade routes, was mapped first, its ports rendered in such detail that modern overlays often match satellite images. Later charts ventured into the Atlantic, tracing the coasts of Africa and Europe with growing confidence. Yet portolan charts weren't foolproof. Magnetic declination, the gap between true north and magnetic north, could subtly distort bearings over long distances. And in stormy weather, when landmarks vanished behind rain or fog, The charts were useless without celestial backups, but for coastal traders, pirates, and explorers, they were indispensable. Imagine a Venetian galley captain unrolling his chart under lamplight, tracing a finger along a room line from Crete to Alexandria. That single sheet held generations of hard-won knowledge, turning a perilous journey into a calculated risk. These maps didn't just guide ships, they shaped empires. Nations guarded their best charts as state secrets, knowing control of trade routes meant control of wealth. When the Portuguese began their voyages down Africa, they redrew portolan charts with each new discovery, their room lines stretching farther than ever before. And when Columbus set sail, he carried charts blending medieval portolans with wild guesses, a mix of precision and hope that defined the age. In the end, portolan charts were more than tools. They were testaments to human curiosity, to the relentless drive to turn the unknown into something you could hold in your hands. The magnetic compass didn't just change navigation, it rewrote the rules of exploration. Long before it reached European ships, this humble tool was already revolutionizing travel in China, where it first appeared as early as the 2nd century. Originally used for divination and geomancy, aligning buildings with cosmic harmony, the Chinese soon discovered lodestone's uncanny ability to point north when floated on water or suspended from silk. By the 11th century, Song dynasty sailors were mounting magnetized needles on wooden fish or turtle-shaped floats, creating the world's first marine compasses. These weren't just gadgets, they were game changers, allowing ships to navigate safely even when clouds hid the sun or storms obscured the stars. But how did a Chinese divination tool end up steering European voyages to new continents? The answer lies in the sprawling networks of the Silk Road and the bustling ports of the Indian Ocean. Arab traders who'd long mastered the monsoon winds likely encountered compasses through commerce with China and quickly recognized their potential. By the 12th century, Persian and Arab sailors were using floating needles to cross the Arabian Sea, their knowledge eventually filtering to Mediterranean merchants through hubs like Alexandria and Sicily. When the compass reached Europe around the late 12th century, it arrived at the perfect moment, just as Italian city-states and Iberian kingdoms were hungry for any edge in the cutthroat world of maritime trade. At its core, the compass was deceptively simple. A magnetized needle balanced on a pivot or floated in water would align itself with Earth's magnetic field, pointing roughly north. But roughly was the catch. Early compasses didn't point to true north, the geographic pole, but to magnetic north, a shifting point influenced by Earth's molten iron core. Mariners learned to account for this variation through trial and error, adjusting their bearings based on local knowledge passed down like trade secrets. Some Venetian captains kept handwritten logs of magnetic deviations along their routes, scribbled in code to deter rivals. This secrecy hints at the compass's real power. It wasn't just a tool, but a strategic advantage. Imagine two merchant ships leaving Genoa for Constantinople, one guided by an experienced pilot with a well-calibrated compass, the other relying on stars and guesswork. The first might shave days off the journey, dodging headwinds and pirates, while the second risked wandering into hostile waters. No wonder compasses were often locked away when foreign sailors came aboard, or why Portuguese navigators like Prince Henry the Navigator hoarded advanced design. The compass didn't just make travel safer, it made empires. By the 15th century, compasses had evolved into sophisticated instruments, mounted in gimbaled boxes to stay level on rough seas. The dry compass, with its needle pinned beneath a glass cover, became the standard for explorers like Vasco da Gama and Columbus. But the real marvel was how this ancient invention democratized navigation. No longer did sailors need years of training to read the stars or interpret wave patterns. With a compass, even a novice could hold a course, as long as they remembered to keep it far from iron cannons or cargo, which could send the needle spinning wildly. In the end, the compass's legacy wasn't just about pointing north. It was about trust, about sailors learning to rely on an invisible force, a whisper from the planet itself. For the first time, humans could defy the chaos of wind and current, cutting straight across the open ocean with a confidence that would eventually redraw the map of the world. For sailors crossing vast oceans, the wind wasn't just a force, it was a language. Every gust, every shift in direction carried meaning, and mastering its patterns meant the difference between a swift voyage and months of struggle. That's where wind roses came in. These circular diagrams, sometimes etched onto portolan charts or carved into navigational tablets, map the prevailing winds of a region like a compass for the air itself. Picture a spoked wheel, each spoke marking a wind direction 12, 16, even 32 points depending on the system. But unlike a compass which showed where north lay, wind roses revealed something far more valuable, where the wind wanted to blow. Take the Mediterranean, where seasonal winds like the Maritime and Sirocco ruled trade routes. A wind rose here might show the Mistral barreling down from the north in winter, perfect for ships sailing from Marseille to Alexandria, while the summer artisans offered a reliable push from the Aegean to Egypt. Merchants didn't just sail blindly, they planned entire journeys around these patterns. A Genoese galley laden with silk might wait months for the right winds to carry it to Constantinople, knowing fighting against them would burn precious supplies and risk storms. But the real magic of wind roses unfolded on longer voyages. Arab traders in the Indian Ocean harnessed the monsoon winds, mausim in Arabic, meaning season, like clockwork. From April to September, the southwest monsoon blew steadily toward India, filling sails with spice-laden air. Come October, the winds reversed, carrying ships back to Arabia and East Africa. These weren't just breezes, they were invisible highways, so predictable that sailors could set calendars by them. The legendary Chinese Admiral Zheng, he used monsoon wind roses to navigate his massive treasure fleets across the Indian Ocean, his ships riding these aerial currents like elevators between continents. Yet wind roses weren't infallible. A sudden squall or an uncharted current could twist a ship off course, and sailors had to adapt on the fly. The Portuguese, venturing down Africa's coast in the 15th century, faced the Barlavento, a vicious headwind that forced them to pioneer the Volta do Mar, a looping detour westward into the Atlantic to catch favorable winds back toward land. It was counterintuitive, like walking backward to move forward, but it worked. Columbus used a similar trick on his first transatlantic voyage, dropping south to the Canaries to catch the easterly trades rather than battling the westerlies head-on. What's striking is how this knowledge was earned, not in classrooms, but through centuries of observation passed down in riddles and rhymes. Viking navigators spoke of the landvinda, a steady wind that smelled of pine and signaled nearby shores. Polynesian wayfinders memorized the Kona winds that shifted with distant islands. Even the ancient Greeks had their Boreas and Zephyrus, gods of wind whose moods dictated sea routes. By the time wind roses appeared on medieval charts, they weren't just tools, they were archives of collective wisdom etched in ink and blood, and when these winds aligned just right. That's when history happened. The Spanish floaters loaded with Aztec gold raced home on the westerlies, their sails fat with fortune. Dutch East India Company ships rode the roaring 40s to cut months off trips to Indonesia. These weren't just journeys, they were dances with the sky, choreographed by generations of sailors who'd learned to listen to the world's breath. The wind rose didn't just show directions, it whispered secrets, and those who understood its language could sail the world. Among the most tantalizing mysteries of medieval navigation are the Viking sunstone's crystalline tools said to pierce through clouds and fog, revealing the sun's hidden position like a celestial cheat code. Norse sagas speak of these stones with reverence, describing how even on overcast days, when the sky was a featureless gray, navigators could hold them aloft and detect the sun's location with eerie precision. But were these accounts just poetic exaggeration, or did Vikings truly possess such advanced technology? The answer lies at the intersection of archaeology, physics, and a dash of myth. Recent discoveries suggest sunstones weren't just legend. In 2013, a team examining the wreck of an Elizabethan warship off the coast of Alderney found a small, translucent crystal near navigation equipment. Though not Viking in origin, its presence hinted at a broader tradition of using optical aids at sea. Even more compelling is a calcite crystal unearthed from a Viking Age site in Iceland, its surfaces worn smooth, perhaps from years of handling. Calcite, also known as Iceland spar, has a unique property called birefringence. When light passes through it, the crystal splits into two beams. By rotating the stone until the beams align in brightness, a navigator could pinpoint the sun's position, even through dense cloud cover. Skeptics argue that sagas are unreliable sources, blending fact with folklore. Yet experimental archaeology offers striking support. Researchers have replicated Viking voyages using calcite sunstones, finding they can determine the sun's location within a few degrees accurate enough to guide a longship across the North Atlantic. The trick works because sunlight, even when diffused by clouds, remains polarized, vibrating in specific directions. A sunstone acts like a filter, revealing the hidden pattern of light that points unerringly to the sun's position. What's fascinating is how this method dovetails with other Viking techniques. On the open ocean where landmarks vanished, they combined sunstones with horizon boards, wooden discs marked with notches to measure the sun's height. Together, these tools formed a rudimentary but effective navigation system, allowing Vikings to reach places like Newfoundland centuries before Columbus. And while no sunstone has been found in a definitively Viking navigational context, the absence of evidence isn't evidence of absence. These were practical tools, not ceremonial objects, likely lost or discarded over time. The debate over sunstones reveals something deeper about medieval navigation. It was a blend of innovation and intuition. Vikings didn't just rely on tools, they read waves, watched migrating birds, and memorized the stars. A sunstone wasn't magic, it was science harnessed by people who refused to let the unknown stop them. Whether or not every Viking ship carried one, the principle behind them is sound, proving once again that the past's greatest secrets often lie in the margins between myth and reality. In the vast emptiness of the open ocean, where waves stretched endlessly in every direction, medieval sailors found unlikely guides, creatures that couldn't even read a map. Birds, whales, even the drift of seaweed became silent partners in navigation, offering clues invisible to the untrained eye. Take seabirds, for instance. A lone gull circling high above wasn't just a sign of life, it was a living compass. Experienced sailors knew certain birds, like the northern gannet or the albatross, would fly out to sea to feed but always return to land by nightfall. Spotting one in the morning meant land lay in the direction it came from. The Vikings had a saying, "Follow the fulmar, find the fjord." They'd release captured birds mid-voyage, watching their flight paths like arrows pointing to safety. If the bird flew in a circle or returned to the ship, land was still distant, but if it streaked purposefully in one direction, that's where the crew would steer. Then there were the whales, not just as obstacles to avoid, but as living signposts. Sperm whales, often found in deep waters, signaled the edge of continental shelves, while humpbacks frequented shallower feeding grounds near coastlines. Sailors in the North Atlantic learned to distinguish their spouts from a distance, using them to gauge proximity to land. Even their behavior told stories. Whales breaching in calm waters might hint at approaching storms, as they sensed shifts in barometric pressure long before humans could. But perhaps the most underrated navigators were the humble plants. Patches of floating sargassum weed, drifting in the Gulf Stream, acted as natural road maps for sailors crossing the Atlantic. Portuguese explorers noted how its presence thickened near the Azores, a telltale sign they were nearing the archipelago. Polynesian voyagers took it further, reading ocean currents by the way seaweed clusters aligned knowledge so precise they could detect invisible islands over the horizon. These methods weren't foolproof, of course. A bird might lead a ship astray if lost itself, and not all whales followed predictable routes. Yet when combined with celestial navigation and dead reckoning, observing nature's rhythms turned guesswork into strategy. The ocean wasn't just a desert to cross, it was a living atlas, its pages written in wings, waves, and wandering routes. For sailors who knew how to read it, the sea's creatures weren't just passengers, they were the original navigators. For sailors creeping along fog-shrouded coastlines, few sights were more welcome than the flicker of a distant lighthouse. These towering sentinels, often perched on jagged cliffs or lonely islands, served as the final safeguard against disaster, a glowing hand reaching out to steer ships away from hidden rocks and shallow graves. But lighthouses were just the most visible part of a much older system of coastal navigation, one that blended human ingenuity with nature's own signposts. Along the North Sea, for instance, Viking navigators used towering white cliffs like Dovers as natural beacons, their chalk faces gleaming in sunlight like polished mirrors. In the Mediterranean, ancient sailors memorized the silhouette of coastal mountains, knowing a particular peak's jagged profile could lead them safely into harbor even in pitch darkness. The earliest lighthouses weren't stone towers but bonfires, simple piles of wood lit on hilltops by coastal communities. The Greeks and Romans elevated this idea into marvels like the Pharaohs of Alexandria, a staggering 400-foot tower whose polished bronze mirrors could reflect firelight for 30 miles. But it was in the Middle Ages that lighthouse technology truly flourished, especially in Europe's busiest shipping lanes. The Cordouan Lighthouse, built in France in 1611 but standing on medieval foundations, became a masterpiece of the craft, its lantern room stocked with racks of candles, later replaced by oil lamps that burned through the night. What made these structures so vital wasn't just their light but their distinctiveness. A skilled pilot could identify individual lighthouses by the pattern of their flashes, some quick, some slow, coded like Maritime more centuries before electricity. Yet lighthouses alone couldn't cover every hazard. That's where smaller markers came in: buoys, cairns, and even deliberately wrecked ships. In the Baltic, fishermen piled stones into tall cairns called varden to mark safe passages between skerries. The Hanseatic League, a powerhouse of medieval trade, maintained chains of pole-mounted baskets filled with burning tar along the German coast. And in Cornwall, locals would hang lanterns from the masts of beached ships, turning them into improvised beacons. The most ingenious markers, though, were the ones nature provided. The Vikings spoke of ley lines, not mystical energies, but natural alignments where a distant waterfall's roar or a peculiar rock formation lined up perfectly with a hidden harbor entrance. What's striking is how these systems evolved through disaster. After countless ships foundered on England's Goodwin Sands, a shifting sandbar dubbed the Great Ship Swallower, medieval authorities installed a warning bell on a buoy that rang with the waves. When storms silenced it, they chained a monk to the structure to manually strike the clapper, giving rise to the gruesome legend of the Goodwin Bell Monk. Along Brittany's Ras de Seine, where tides raced like rivers, sailors learned to time their passage by watching whirlpools form around certain rocks, using them as aquatic traffic lights. The real magic of coastal navigation, though, lay in its adaptability. A lighthouse might guide ships to a harbor's mouth, but only local knowledge could thread them through its labyrinth of docks and currents. Venetian lagoon pilots, for instance, memorized the exact locations of submerged posts painted with family crests, each marking a safe channel known only to guild members. In Japan, fishermen embedded seashells in tidal flats at precise intervals, creating shimmering pathways visible only at low tide. This wasn't just navigation, it was a dialogue between humans and the sea, where every cliff, every flickering flame told sailors, "This way home." By the late Middle Ages, coastal markers had grown into elaborate networks, with lighthouses funded by tolls collected from grateful shipowners. But their greatest legacy wasn't architectural, it was psychological. For crews battered by weeks at sea, the first glimpse of a lighthouse beam cutting through storm clouds wasn't just a navigational aid. It was hope, solid as stone and bright as fire, promising that the wilderness of waves had an end. And in that moment, every sailor became part of an unbroken chain stretching back centuries, where light always meant land, and land meant survival. Religious pilgrimages were more than spiritual journeys. They were the medieval internet, transmitting ideas across continents with every ship that carried the faithful toward holy sites. Picture a cramped pilgrim galley leaving Venice for Jerusalem, crammed with merchants, monks, and nobles. Below deck, Venetian pilots pored over portolan charts while Arab navigators adjusted their astrolabes, and Byzantine sailors argued over the wind patterns near Cyprus. This wasn't just a voyage of devotion, it was a floating symposium of navigation where techniques from 3 continents collided and cross-pollinated. The sheer scale of medieval pilgrimage made it a powerhouse of knowledge exchange. Every year, thousands set sail for Compostela, Mecca, or the Holy Land, their routes stitching together the ports of Europe, Africa, and Asia. Muslim pilgrims traveling from Indonesia to Arabia brought with them the camel, a simple wooden card used to measure star heights, introducing it to Arab navigators who refined it further. Christian pilgrims returning from Jerusalem carried fragments of Arab star charts, which would later inspire the elaborate celestial maps of Renaissance Europe. Even the humble compass likely hitched a ride westward, not through traders or warriors, but pilgrims, Italian friars marveling at the floating needles used by Syrian sailors during their stopovers in Acre. Pilgrim ships became accidental classrooms. Wealthy travelers like the 14th century German knight Arnold von Harff kept meticulous diaries, jotting down navigation tricks learned from fellow passengers, how Maltese captains used the North Star to correct their compasses, or why Egyptian pilots waited for the star Canopus to appear before crossing the Red Sea. These weren't just personal notes, they circulated as proto-guidebooks, spreading localized knowledge across borders. The famous 12th century Jewish pilgrim Benjamin of Tudela recorded how Indian Ocean navigators timed their voyages by the monsoon winds, a technique later adopted by Portuguese explorers. Religious institutions themselves became hubs of navigational innovation. Monasteries along the Camino de Santiago doubled as data centers, compiling tide tables for coastal pilgrims. The Knights Hospitaller, tasked with protecting travelers to Jerusalem, maintained detailed logs of Mediterranean currents and pirate ambush points, intelligence later repurposed for Crusader naval campaigns. Even the design of ships evolved to meet pilgrimage demands. The Venetian Galea Grossa, with its 3 masts and lateen sails, was perfected to ferry pilgrims efficiently, its hybrid rigging borrowing from Arab dhow designs. But the real legacy of pilgrimage navigation lies in its democratization. Unlike state-sponsored exploration or military campaigns, pilgrimages were open to all peasants and princes alike. A farmer from Flanders might learn to use a quadrant from a Sicilian sailor on his way to Rome, then teach it to his neighbors back home. Over centuries, this trickle of shared knowledge eroded the monopoly that elite navigators once held. By the time Columbus set sail, the tools of navigation weren't secrets guarded in royal courts, they were common currency, honed and shared by countless anonymous travelers who'd braved the sea not for gold or glory but for faith. And perhaps that's the most striking irony of all. The greatest navigational breakthroughs of the Middle Ages didn't come from wars or trade empires, they emerged from the quiet, relentless movement of ordinary people, each adding a stitch to the vast tapestry of human knowledge. A pilgrim's prayer and a sailor's star chart might seem worlds apart, but together they wove the threads that would eventually bind the globe. Venice's gondoliers weren't just romantic figures gliding through canals, they were the medieval equivalent of precision pilots, mastering waterways so treacherous that one wrong turn could mean a shipwreck. While most Mediterranean sailors worried about open seas, Venetians faced a maze of shallow channels, shifting sandbars, and tides that could rise and fall by 6 feet in hours. Their secret, a navigation system so refined it turned the city's lagoon into a highway, one that would eventually reshape maritime trade across the Mediterranean. At the heart of their skill was an intimate knowledge of brick-hole clusters of wooden pilings driven into the lagoon floor, marking safe passages like underwater street signs. These weren't random markers. Each group was arranged in distinct patterns visible only to trained eyes. 3 pilings in a triangle might signal deep water, while a straight line warned of lurking sandbanks. Gondoliers memorized these layouts as children, learning to read the water's surface for subtle clues. A slight ripple could betray a hidden current, while the way algae clung to a piling revealed the tide's strength. This wasn't just navigation, it was a language spoken in whispers between the hull and the waves. But their genius didn't stop there. Venetian mariners perfected the art of deadstick steering, maneuvering heavy cargo ships through narrow channels without oars or sails. By lashing smaller boats called piote to the sides of a galley, they could pivot the massive vessel like a floating lever, using the tides themselves as propulsion. It was a technique honed by necessity. Venice's wealth depended on spices and silk arriving intact, and a single grounded ship could bankrupt a merchant family. The real game-changer, though, was their use of tidal charts centuries before they became standard elsewhere. Monks at the monastery of San Nicolo compiled meticulous records of the lagoon's ebbs and flows, noting how the moon's phases altered currents near the Lido Inlet. These charts weren't just scribbled notes, they were color-coded masterpieces with red ink marking whirlpools that appeared only during spring tides and blue indicating safe routes for low-draft vessels. Foreign captains paid dearly for copies, but the Venetians guarded their best charts like state secrets. After all, controlling knowledge meant controlling trade. What's astonishing is how these tricks spilled beyond the lagoon. When Venetian merchants established colonies in Crete and Cyprus, they brought their navigation methods with them, teaching Greek and Arab sailors to mark shallow reefs with weighted baskets instead of brick-hole. Their tidal calculations even influenced Atlantic explorers. Columbus reportedly carried a Venetian tide table on his first voyage, using it to predict Caribbean currents. And that iconic gondolier's stroke, where the oar twists at the end of each push, it's physics in motion, a technique borrowed by Portuguese sailors to steer caravels more efficiently. Yet the gondolier's greatest legacy was their mindset. Where others saw obstacles, they saw opportunities. When silt blocked their usual routes, they improvised new ones overnight. When fog blinded rival ships, they navigated by the echo of church bells bouncing off stone walls. This adaptability didn't just keep Venice afloat, it made the city the Mediterranean's undisputed queen of trade for centuries. The next time you see a gondola gliding effortlessly under a bridge, remember, you're watching the last living heirs of a navigation revolution that once ruled the seas. While European ships were still hugging coastlines, Chinese junks were already mastering the open ocean with innovations that wouldn't reach the West for centuries. These towering vessels, with their iconic bat-wing sails and floating castles, weren't just feats of engineering, they were floating laboratories of navigation, packed with tools that gave their crews an almost uncanny edge. Take the sternpost rudder, a seemingly simple advancement that revolutionized seafaring. Unlike European ships reliant on cumbersome steering oars lashed to the sides, junks had a single, massive rudder mounted directly on the sternpost, an innovation as transformative as swapping a horse cart for a sports car. This design allowed precise control even in rough seas, letting Chinese admirals like Zheng He maneuver their 400-foot treasure ships through narrow straits and monsoons with ease. But the real marvel lay in how these ships were guided. Chinese navigators didn't just follow the stars, they mapped them with breathtaking precision. The Xingtu, or star charts, used during the Ming Dynasty weren't crude sketches but detailed celestial atlases, plotting over 1,000 stars with annotations on seasonal visibility and brightness. Sailors could cross-reference these charts with handheld zinc and star dials made of lacquered wood to pinpoint their latitude by measuring the angle of Polaris or the Southern Cross. What set these tools apart wasn't just their accuracy but their portability. While European astrolabes required stable platforms, a xingpan could be used on a rolling deck, its rotating discs calibrated to the observer's location. The genius of Chinese navigation, though, went beyond hardware. It was in their systems. Aboard Zheng He's fleet, every ship carried a shuolu, a water clock synchronized to the flagship's master timer. This let the entire armada coordinate maneuvers across miles of ocean, an early form of naval network technology. They even developed early depth-sounding techniques, lowering lead weights coated in tallow to sample seabed composition. Clay, sand, or shell fragments revealing their proximity to known coasts. Perhaps most startling was their use of magnetic compasses, not just as tools but as central navigational hubs. Chinese compasses, floating in bowls of water to dampen ship movement, were housed in elaborate compass cabins where officers tracked course changes on Lupan, route maps annotated with magnetic variation centuries before Europeans understood declination. These weren't just voyages, they were exercises in precision where every ripple of the compass needle was logged, every star sighting cross-checked. Yet for all their sophistication, these methods shared a common philosophy, harmony with nature rather than conquest of it. Where European navigators later fought against currents, Chinese pilots studied the Liuqiao tidal charts so detailed they predicted hourly water movements in the Malacca Strait. Their junk sails, rigged with bamboo battens, could be reefed or adjusted in seconds to exploit subtle wind shifts, turning adversity into advantage. The legacy of these innovations quietly shaped global navigation. Arab traders adopted the sternpost rudder after encountering junks in the Indian Ocean, passing it to Mediterranean shipwrights. Portuguese explorers, upon reaching Asia, were stunned to find compasses far advanced from their own, and those star charts, some scholars believe fragments made their way to Europe via the Silk Road, subtly influencing Renaissance cartography. The irony is profound. While the West remembers the Age of Discovery as its own triumph, many of its tools were perfected, and in some cases, invented on the decks of Chinese junks, where the art of navigation had already reached heights the world would take centuries to rediscover. While European sailors struggled with bulky astrolabes, Arab navigators in the Indian Ocean were mastering latitude with nothing more than a wooden card and a knotted string, the camel. This deceptively simple tool, no larger than a modern business card, became the cornerstone of trade between Zanzibar and Canton, allowing merchants to cross thousands of miles of open water with startling accuracy. Picture a rectangular piece of wood held at arm's length toward the horizon. A string attached to its center ran through 9 precisely spaced knots, each representing a key port's latitude along the monsoon routes. To use it, a sailor would grip the string at the appropriate knot, then adjust the card until its lower edge touched the horizon while its top aligned with Polaris or the Southern Cross. The angle revealed their position relative to known destinations, like a celestial ruler measuring their place on Earth. What made the camel revolutionary wasn't just its precision, but its adaptability. Unlike fixed instruments that required calibration for different regions, the camel's knots could be retied for new trade routes. A merchant sailing from Basra to Malacca might use one set of knots, while a Dhow captain running spices from Aden to Calicut relied on another. Some camels even featured interchangeable strings for different hemispheres, allowing navigators to switch between tracking Polaris in the north and the Southern Cross below the equator. This flexibility made it indispensable for the Indian Ocean's sprawling networks, where a single voyage might pass through Arab, African, Indian, and Southeast Asian waters. The camel's spread tells a story of cultural exchange as rich as the cargoes it guided. Arab traders likely adapted it from earlier Polynesian or Chinese tools, refining it with mathematical precision. Persian geographers wrote detailed camel manuals, complete with star tables for 23 major ports. By the 15th century, versions of the camel appeared as far west as Portugal, where Prince Henry's navigators studied captured Arab navigational texts, and as far east as Java, where local sailors combined its principles with traditional wave-reading techniques. Even the Great Zheng, his fleet, may have used modified camels during their legendary voyages, blending Chinese and Arab navigation methods into something entirely new. But the camel's true brilliance lay in its democratization of navigation. Unlike expensive brass instruments reserved for elite pilots, a camel could be carved from driftwood by any sailor with a knife and string. Its simplicity meant knowledge could pass orally from parent to child, captain to apprentice, without reliance on rare manuscripts or royal patronage. When Vasco da Gama finally rounded the Cape of Good Hope in 1497, his Arab pilot Ibn Majid likely guided the Portuguese fleet using nothing more than this humble tool, proof that sometimes the most advanced technology isn't the most complicated but the most accessible. What survives today isn't just a relic in museums but a philosophy. Modern navigators still use the camel's core principle, measuring celestial angles in sextants and satellite systems. Its knots echo in the way pilots calculate flight paths, and its adaptability lives on in apps that merge ancient star lore with GPS. The camel didn't just measure latitude, it bridged worlds, turning the Indian Ocean from a barrier into a highway of ideas, goods, and cultures. And in that, it was more than a tool, it was a key that unlocked half the globe. The Arctic was no match for Viking ingenuity. Where most saw a frozen wasteland, Norse explorers like Eric the Red spotted opportunity, stretches of open water between ice flows that led to uncharted land. Their secret weapon wasn't brute strength, but an intimate understanding of nature's subtle cues. Take the Solfar or sun compass, a wooden disc etched with precise markings that could pinpoint the sun's position even when clouds obscured all but the faintest glow. By aligning the shadow of a central gnomon with carved notches, Viking navigators could maintain course for days without seeing land. What's remarkable isn't just the tool's accuracy. Replicas have been shown to work within 2 degrees of error, but how portable it was. A sun compass small enough to fit in a warrior's palm could guide a longship across hundreds of miles of trackless sea. Yet tools alone didn't guarantee survival in the far north. Viking navigation was a living tradition, passed down through rhymes and riddles that encoded generations of hard-won knowledge. One surviving Icelandic poem describes how to spot the whale's road, not just open water, but specific currents where prey gathered, signaling safe passage. Another verse warns of Hafjörðingar, towering sea fences of colliding waves that marked the edge of Arctic ice shelves. These weren't mere stories, they were survival algorithms refined through trial and error. When Eric the Red led settlers to Greenland in 982, he didn't rely on charts, he followed Landvættir, the land spirits his crew claimed to sense in changes in wind patterns and the flight of snow buntings. The true test of these methods came in the voyages to Vinland, modern Newfoundland. Here, where icebergs loomed like floating fortresses and fog could linger for weeks, the Vikings developed a trick still used by Inuit hunters today, reading the color of the sky. A faint, dark streak on the horizon, kolsvarter, or coal black, meant open water reflecting distant ice. Pale streaks hinted at land-fast ice, while a peculiar shimmer called glass signaled thin, navigable ice. Combined with their sun compasses and star lore, these techniques allowed them to traverse waters that would baffle European sailors for centuries. What's often overlooked is how Viking navigators adapted their southern methods to the Arctic's unique challenges. In Mediterranean latitudes, Polaris sat high in the sky, but near Greenland, it hovered just above the horizon, easy to lose behind waves or ice. The solution: a simple stick called a stavnling, held upright to measure the star's height against its tip. And when the midnight sun erased all stars, they watched for Utsening, their outlooking a refraction effect where distant coastlines appeared to float above the horizon like mirages. Archaeology continues to uncover their brilliance. A fragment of a sun compass found in Greenland's Unartok settlement bears notches calibrated for a voyage between Norway and the Canadian Arctic, proof these weren't just random carvings but precise instruments. Even their ships played a role. The Nar's shallow draft let it glide over ice-choked shallows where deeper vessels would founder. The legacy of Norse polar exploration isn't just in the lands they reached, but in the mindset they embodied. Where others saw barriers, they saw patterns. When tools failed, they turned to tradition. And in the harshest corners of the Earth, they didn't just survive, they thrived, leaving behind navigation secrets so effective, modern Arctic researchers still consult Viking sagas for clues. Their greatest invention wasn't a compass or a ship, but a way of seeing the world that turned ice into opportunity. Among the many innovations that propelled Europe into the Age of Discovery, none was as transformative as Prince Henry the Navigator's legendary school at Sagres. Perched on the windswept cliffs of Portugal's Algarve coast, this gathering of scholars, sailors, and craftsmen became the medieval equivalent of a cutting-edge research lab, a place where theoretical knowledge met hard-won experience. But contrary to popular myth, Sagres wasn't a formal university with ivy-covered walls. It was more like a think tank for explorers, where shipwrights debated star charts with astronomers and Moorish cartographers shared secrets with Genos merchants. At its core, the Sagres School functioned as a brutal training ground for reality. Young navigators didn't just memorize star positions. They learned to calibrate astrolabes on pitching decks, their hands lashed by salt spray. They pored over captured Arab portolan charts, deciphering Arabic numerals and wind-rose symbols that held the key to Africa's uncharted coasts. Prince Henry's masterstroke was forcing these men to test every theory in practice. A promising new quadrant design sent it out on the next caravel to Guinea. A revised method for measuring Polaris let the sailors judge its worth after 6 months battling the Canary Current. There were no armchair navigators at Sagres, only those who'd survived the ocean's verdict. The school's real genius lay in its interdisciplinary approach. Jewish mathematicians from Majorca taught sailors to calculate latitude using cross staffs, while German instrument makers refined compass designs in smoky workshops. Perhaps most crucially, Prince Henry collected accounts from every traveler he could corner: African traders who knew the monsoon cycles of the Indian Ocean, Sicilian fishermen who'd ventured beyond the Azores. These fragments of oral knowledge, once dismissed as sailors' superstition, were cross-referenced with Ptolemy's ancient texts and Arab star tables. The result was a living database of global navigation, constantly updated by each returning caravel. What emerged from this cauldron of ideas were tools that changed history. The caravel itself, a nimble hybrid of Mediterranean lateen sails and Atlantic square rigging, was perfected at Sagres shipyards. Navigators standardized the mariner's astrolabe here, adapting its delicate brass components to withstand Atlantic gales. Even simple innovations like the traverse board, a peg-studded disc for logging daily courses, helped turn dead reckoning from guesswork into science. But Sagres' greatest export wasn't technology, it was a mindset. Graduates like Diogo Cao and Bartolomeu Dias approached exploration as systematic experimentation. When Dias rounded the Cape of Good Hope in 1488, he didn't just rely on courage. He used Sagres-taught methods to measure tidal patterns, confirming Africa's southern tip wasn't another dead end. This blending of boldness and methodology would define the Iberian age of exploration. From Da Gama's spice routes to Magellan's circumnavigation, the school's influence rippled far beyond Portugal. Italian bankers studied its maps to finance new trade ventures, while French privateers reverse-engineered captured caravels. Most ironically, Christopher Columbus, though turned away by Prince Henry's successors, absorbed Saga's techniques during his years in Lisbon. The very tools that guided him westward were born in those windswept workshops. By the time Vasco da Gama reached India in 1498, the Saga's model had rendered itself obsolete. Its greatest lesson, that exploration thrived when theory and practice collided, had spread across Europe's maritime nations. But for a few decades, on that lonely promontory where the Mediterranean met the Atlantic, a handful of visionaries proved that navigation wasn't just an art or a science, but the alchemy that turned curiosity into conquest. While European navigators relied on compasses and astrolabes, Polynesian wayfinders crossed thousands of miles of open ocean using nothing but memory and observation, a living library of the sea encoded in chants and stories. Picture a double-hulled canoe at sunrise, its sails catching the wind as a master navigator squints at the horizon. No maps, no instruments, just generations of knowledge humming in his bones, telling him which star will rise where, how the swells will bend around unseen islands, even which birds fly out at dawn to fish and return at dusk. This wasn't just navigation, it was a conversation with the natural world, refined over centuries into an art form so precise, it put European methods to shame. The foundation of Polynesian wayfinding lay in the star compass, not a physical tool, but a mental map dividing the horizon into 32 directional houses, each marked by a specific star's rising and setting points. Navigators like the legendary Maupiailog could name hundreds of stars and their seasonal paths, using them as fixed guides even when clouds obscured the sky. But stars were just the beginning. Wave pilots, experts in reading ocean swells, could detect land long before it appeared by interpreting subtle patterns in the water. A distant island might refract incoming swells, creating a V-shaped ripple or quieting the chop in ways invisible to untrained eyes. Some navigators claimed they could feel these shifts through their feet, sensing vibrations in the hull like a musician tuning an instrument. Wildlife provided another layer of intelligence. Frigate birds, which refused to land on water, always signaled near by land when seen resting on the surface. Schools of certain fish clustered near coral outcrops, while cloud formations often piled up over islands due to rising thermals, the most astonishing trick. Following bioluminescence trails, glowing plankton that collect in currents flowing toward land, creating shimmering highways in the night sea. These weren't random observations, they were part of a rigorous oral curriculum. Apprentice navigators spent years blindfolded in canoes, learning to track direction by wave motion alone, or memorizing hundreds of nautical chants that encoded routes like lyrical GPS coordinates. What set Polynesian navigation apart was its adaptability. Unlike European methods tied to rigid instruments, wayfinding flourished through constant improvisation. When storms scattered star bearings, navigators switched to backup cues: the taste of seaweed fresher near land, the color of the deep lighter over reefs, even the smell of the wind hinting at distant flowers. This fluidity allowed voyages Europeans deemed impossible, like the settlement of Rapa Nui, Easter Island, over 2,000 miles from the nearest continent, a journey equivalent to sailing from London to Iceland without charts. The contrast with medieval Europe couldn't be starker. Where Portuguese caravels hugged coasts for fear of getting lost, Polynesian canoes struck straight across the Pacific's emptiness. While European navigators fretted over magnetic declination, wayfinders calibrated their internal compasses daily by the rising sun. And where European knowledge was locked in precious manuscripts, Polynesian wisdom lived in song and story, passed down in communal learning sessions under the stars. This divergence wasn't about superiority, it reflected different relationships with the ocean. For Europeans, the sea was a chaotic force to be mastered with technology. For Polynesians, it was a knowable entity, its rhythms as familiar as a heartbeat. When Maupiilug famously guided the Hokulea canoe from Hawaii to Tahiti in 1976 using only traditional methods, he didn't just revive a lost art, he proved that the old ways weren't primitive. They were a masterpiece of human ingenuity, forged by people who listened to the world so deeply they could hear islands singing beneath the waves. For medieval armies, the sea wasn't just a battlefield. It was the ultimate chessboard where controlling the tides meant controlling empires. Take the Crusades, where European knights who'd spent lifetimes mastering land warfare suddenly found themselves at the mercy of Mediterranean currents. Transporting thousands of men, horses, and siege engines across open water required more than brute strength. It demanded an intimate grasp of winds, coastlines, and seasonal patterns. When Richard the Lionheart set sail for the Holy Land in 1190, his fleet didn't just follow the shoreline, they rode the Meltemi, the fierce summer winds that could slash weeks off the journey. But one misjudgment could be catastrophic. The same currents that sped ships toward Acre could dash them against Cyprus's rocks, as Richard learned when storms scattered his fleet, forcing him to conquer the island just to regroup. Naval invasions turned navigation into a weapon. During the 100 Years' War, English longbowmen crossing the Channel didn't just need calm seas, they needed to hit the right beaches. Slip too far east and they'd face fortified ports, drift west and they'd waste days marching through marshes. The answer: local fishermen pressed into service as human GPS systems. These men knew the tidal quirks of Normandy's coast, where sandbars lurked beneath high tide, which coves offered shelter from autumn gales. At the Battle of Sluys in 1340, this knowledge proved decisive. English ships, guided by pilots who understood the Zwin estuary's shallow channels, outmaneuvered the French fleet, trapping them in waters too tight for retreat. But the real game changer was the blockade. Controlling sea routes meant starving out enemies or smuggling in reinforcements. Venetian admirals during the Fourth Crusade didn't just sail to Constantinople, they strangled its supply lines, using charts of the Dardanelles to intercept grain ships in the narrows where currents ran fastest. Geno's carracks, armed with stolen Byzantine portolans, became masters of ambush, hiding behind Aegean islands until Ottoman troop transports drifted into range. Yet for all their sophistication, medieval naval warfare had a glaring weakness. Storms could scatter fleets as easily as enemy fire. When Kublai Khan's armada tried to invade Japan in 1281, typhoon winds, later called kamikaze or divine winds, obliterated his ships not because they were outmaneuvered, but because Mongol navigators misread the seasonal monsoon. The sea didn't take sides, it punished arrogance. That's why the smartest commanders treated navigators like royalty. Henry V's invasion of France in 1415 succeeded largely because he hired Castilian pilots who'd memorized the Seine's tidal bore, the exact hour when its raging currents would slacken, letting his troops wade ashore unopposed. What emerges isn't just a tale of battles, but of logistics. The difference between victory and ruin often came down to who could read a tide table or spot the warning flicker of bioluminescence before a night attack. When Joan of Arc begged for ships to relieve besieged Orleans, it wasn't courage she lacked. It was pilots who could sneak past English patrols using moonless night currents. In the end, medieval naval warfare wasn't about who had the most ships, but who best understood the invisible highways of the deep. Beneath the star charts and compass bearings lay another hidden layer of medieval navigation, one woven from prayers, omens, and the whispered blessings of saints. For sailors facing the abyss, faith wasn't just comfort, it was a vital tool as real as any astrolabe. Take St. Elmo's fire, the eerie blue glow that sometimes clung to ship masts during storms. To modern eyes, it's static electricity, but to medieval crews, it was the physical touch of St. Erasmus of Antioch, their patron saint. When those ghostly flames appeared, sailors dropped to their knees in gratitude, convinced the saint had arrived to ward off disaster. Some captains even kept logs of these encounters, noting how storms often eased after the apparition, reinforcing the legend. Voyages were planned around celestial signs and sacred calendars. No captain worth his salt would set sail on the feast of the Exaltation of the Cross, September 14th, believing the day cursed after a disastrous Venetian fleet was lost on that date in the 13th century. Conversely, favorable saints had their own feast days. St. Nicholas, patron of mariners, guaranteed safe passage if departure coincided with his December 6th celebration. Ships' altars often held relics, fragments of saintly bones or splinters from the true cross in locked cabinets that doubled as emergency luck charms during storms. The Santa Maria, Columbus's flagship, reportedly carried a piece of the Virgin Mary's girdle, unveiled only when all other navigation methods failed. But superstition wasn't passive, it demanded ritual. Basque whalers recited the Agajonak each morning, a hymn to the Lord of the Depths believed to calm waves. Breton fishermen refused to speak the word rabbit at sea, swapping it for long-eared creature to avoid summoning storms. The most elaborate rites belonged to the Perdiz ceremony, where Spanish crews tossed a clay effigy of a bird overboard after passing Gibraltar, a symbolic offering to the Atlantic for safe passage. These weren't mere habits, they were survival strategies, psychological anchors in a world where wind and waves obeyed no mortal law. The line between faith and practicality often blurred. Venetian navigators used the mariner's psalms verses from the Bible thought to predict weather as backup when clouds blocked the stars. One passage, "He maketh the storm a calm, so that the waves thereof are still," was recited while scanning the horizon for squalls. Icelandic sagas tell of runes carved into ship prows to bind the wind, a practice that may have originated with observing how certain wood carvings affected sail aerodynamics without crews realizing the physics behind it. Even the design of ships reflected this duality. The Christopher figurehead on Portuguese caravels wasn't just decoration, it was a spiritual bowsprit believed to literally bear Christ across uncharted waters. Perhaps no story captures this fusion better than the legend of the Carta Pisana. This groundbreaking 13th century portolan chart was said to contain not just accurate coastlines, but invisible, sacred meridians, lines connecting monasteries where monks prayed simultaneously to guide ships spiritually. Whether true or not, the tale reveals how medieval minds saw navigation. A collaboration between human skill and divine grace, where every safe landing was as much miracle as science. In an age when the sea was the great unknown, faith wasn't the opposite of reason. It was the lens through which reason made sense. And in that fragile balance between prayer and compass, sailors found the courage to sail beyond the edge of the world. The ocean has never forgiven arrogance, a lesson written in the shattered hulls of ships that dared defy its secrets. Among history's most chilling disasters, Kublai Khan's lost invasion fleets stand as grim monuments to the limits of medieval navigation. In 1281, the Mongol emperor launched the largest seaborne invasion the world had ever seen. Nearly 4,000 ships carrying over 140,000 soldiers toward Japan. Yet not once but twice typhoons annihilated his fleets. The Japanese called these storms kamikaze, divine winds, but the truth was far more human. Khan's navigators, masters of the steppes but novices at sea, fatally misread the season. They sailed straight into the August typhoon belt, their flat-bottomed river boats no match for the towering waves. Compounding the error, their massive fleet lacked the maneuverability to scatter when the storms hit. Ships collided in the chaos, their crews mostly conscripted Chinese sailors with little loyalty to the Mongols, drowning by the thousands. The disaster wasn't just meteorological, it was a failure to adapt land-based conquest to the ocean's rules. Centuries earlier, the Vikings suffered their own catastrophic miscalculation in the North Atlantic. The Floki Vilja Tharson expedition to Iceland in the 9th century became a cautionary tale of ignoring natural signs. Floki, more farmer than navigator, relied on ravens to find land, a traditional method. But when his birds returned exhausted without spotting shore, he pressed on blindly, only to reach an ice-choked coast too late to plant crops. His starving crew dubbed the island Iceland, a name born of bitter irony. Unlike later settlers who studied drift ice patterns and bird migrations, Floki had gambled on single omens. The difference between survival and failure often came down to layering knowledge: stars and currents, birds and waves. Then there were the mysteries, ships that vanished without wreckage or witness. Medieval chronicles tell of the nameless ship of Brittany, a cog that drifted into port in 1347 with no crew, just half-eaten meals rotting on the tables and a lone dog cowering below decks. Sound familiar? Centuries before the Mary Celeste, this ghost ship hinted at the perils of medieval travel. Scholars now suspect it fell victim to a phenomenon called dead water, where layered salinity in fjords can trap a vessel, sapping its speed until currents drag it helplessly off course. Crews, convinced of supernatural forces, might have abandoned ship prematurely, only to drown in the icy sea while their vessel miraculously broke free. The common thread in these disasters wasn't lack of technology but overconfidence. The Hanseatic League's great crane of 1421, laden with Baltic grain, ignored warnings about the Blankensee sand, a shifting shoal near Lübeck. Their prized Kompasstein, an early magnetic compass, had been stored too close to iron cannons, throwing off its readings by critical degrees. The result: 1,000 tons of wheat sank in minutes, starving Hamburg that winter. Meanwhile, the Spanish San Esteban, part of the doomed 1554 fleet, sailed stubbornly against the Gulf Stream's pull despite Aztec slaves begging the captain to heed the river in the ocean their ancestors had described. All hands were lost, their gold-laden wreck discovered centuries later, miles off their charted course. These tragedies reveal navigation's darkest truth: the sea punishes those who stop listening. Whether ignoring local knowledge like Kublai's men, misreading tools like the Hanseatic merchants, or dismissing environmental cues like Floki, failure came from rigidity. Yet each disaster also pushed progress. The Mongol invasions spurred Japanese coastal watchers to develop early tsunami warning fires. The nameless ship legend led Breton sailors to carry sea books noting dead water zones. Even the San Esteban's wreck improved Spanish maps, correcting Gulf Stream routes for future fleets. The ocean demanded humility, and those who survived its lessons wrote them in blood and ink for the next crew daring enough to sail beyond the horizon. By the 15th century, the scattered innovations of medieval navigation were converging into something revolutionary, a toolkit capable of conquering oceans rather than coastlines. At the heart of this transformation stood the cross-staff, a deceptively simple instrument that finally cracked one of navigation's oldest puzzles: precise latitude measurements at sea. Picture a wooden staff about 3 feet long, with a sliding crosspiece that a sailor could adjust until its ends touched both the horizon and the sun. The angle revealed their position north or south of the equator with startling accuracy. Unlike the delicate Astrolabe, which demanded calm seas, the cross-staff could be used in rougher conditions, its simplicity making it the smartphone of its day, accessible even to less experienced crew members. Portuguese explorers like Bartolomeu Dias relied on it during their perilous journeys down Africa's coast, where shifting winds and unfamiliar stars rendered older methods useless. But tools alone didn't trigger the age of discovery. It was the marriage of technology with a new breed of map. Enter the Padrão Reel, the master chart maintained by Portugal's royal navigators. These weren't static drawings but living documents, updated after every voyage with fresh coastlines, currents, and hazards. When Columbus studied maps in Lisbon before his fateful voyage, he wasn't looking at vague medieval imaginings. He was analyzing layers of hard-won data from decades of Atlantic exploration. The key breakthrough: integration. A captain could now cross-reference his cross-staff readings with a padrão reel that plotted not just land, but wind patterns and magnetic variations, a system so precise that Portuguese ships could return to the same African bays years later with pinpoint accuracy. The real game-changer, though, was the psychological shift these tools enabled. Medieval sailors had crept along coasts like children holding a parent's hand. Renaissance explorers strode into the void. Take Magellan's circumnavigation, an unthinkable gamble without the cross-staff's reliability or the detailed rutters sailing guides that documented Pacific currents. When his fleet entered the uncharted vastness of the Pacific, they weren't blindly hoping for land. They carried centuries of accumulated knowledge, Polynesian stories of distant islands, Arabic treatises on equatorial stars, and Venetian accounts of the Earth's curvature. This wasn't just navigation, it was the birth of global thinking, where every scrap of data from sailors, scholars, and even rivals fused into a cohesive picture of the planet. Yet the transition wasn't smooth. Older methods clung stubbornly to practice. Many captains still trusted lunar charts over compasses during eclipses, and celestial navigation remained an elite skill. The infamous longitude problem, unsolved until the 18th century, meant even Columbus miscalculated his New World landings by nearly 1,000 miles. But the seeds planted by medieval innovators had taken root. The cross-staff evolved into the backstaff, then the sextant. Portolan charts gave way to Mercator's projection. What began as scattered tricks of Viking sunstone, an Arab's camel, had become a universal language of exploration, whispering the same truth to every sailor who dared dream beyond the horizon. The world was knowable. And with each perfected tool, each painstakingly corrected map, the unknown grew a little smaller. Even with all we've uncovered about medieval navigation, there remain puzzles so baffling they border on the supernatural. Consider the voyage of St. Brendan, the 6th century Irish monk who allegedly sailed to the Americas in a wooden carrache, a boat barely fit for river crossings, let alone Atlantic storms. Medieval texts describe his journey in vivid detail. Crystal pillars rising from the sea, islands that turned out to be sleeping whales, even a land of perpetual daylight. For centuries, scholars dismissed it as pious fantasy until archaeologists found traces of early medieval Irish settlements in Newfoundland. How could Brendan's crew, with no compasses or star charts, have survived a crossing that daunted much later explorers? Some theorize they used fog bow navigation, reading the way mist refracted sunlight to guess land direction, while others point to Druidic star lore passed down orally. But the truth, it's still lost to time. Then there's the Zeno map, a 15th century chart depicting the North Atlantic with eerie accuracy, including Greenland's coastline and even hints of North America. The mystery, it claims to be based on voyages from the 1390s by the Zeno brothers of Venice, decades before Columbus. Stranger still, the map shows details like the Faroe Islands' underwater topography, information supposedly unknowable without sonar. Critics call it an elaborate hoax, but recent core samples from Greenland's glaciers match the map's descriptions of volcanic activity. Did the Zenos possess advanced techniques borrowed from Norse or Arab navigators, now erased from history? Or did they stumble upon some forgotten Viking rudder, a sailing manual later destroyed by rival explorers? Perhaps the most tantalizing gaps lie in the Mediterranean. Arab ships routinely crossed from Alexandria to Marseille in under 2 weeks, a speed modern replicas struggle to match without engines. Their secret may have been the green ray, a phenomenon where skilled pilots allegedly read subtle color shifts in seawater to detect distant currents. Spanish archives mention captured Arab navigational almanacs filled with cryptic symbols, burned as heresy during the Inquisition. What knowledge went up in those flames? We found fragments, a star table in a Maltese monastery, a compass rose etched into a Sicilian cave, but the system behind them remains just out of reach. And what of the rumors, whispers of Venetian mirror towers along the Adriatic, using polished bronze to signal ship positions across miles? Tales of Viking sun calipers, wooden devices that measured solar declination more precisely than any astrolabe. The most persistent legend is the Black Scrolls of Pisa, supposedly a collection of Carthaginian navigation spells, smuggled out of burning libraries during the Crusades and hidden beneath the Duomo. Archivists have searched for centuries, they've found nothing, yet every so often a fisherman drags up something strange. A Byzantine dial with unfamiliar constellations, a Chinese-style compass lodged in a Spanish wreck. These aren't just gaps in history, they're missing pieces of a puzzle that once connected the world. For every technique we've reconstructed, there might be 5 others rotting in unmarked graves or crumbling in some overlooked monastic cellar. The irony, the greatest navigational secret of the Middle Ages may be how much they truly knew, and how thoroughly the sea has swallowed their wisdom. The story of medieval navigation isn't just about tools and techniques. It's a testament to human resilience, a dance between ingenuity and peril that reshaped the world. Imagine the courage it took to sail into the unknown with nothing but a wooden compass, a hand-carved quadrant, and a head full of half-remembered star rhymes. Every voyage was a gamble, every successful landing a small miracle. Vikings braved Arctic ice with sunstones clutched in frozen fingers. Arab traders rode monsoon winds like surfers on an invisible highway. Polynesian wayfinders memorized the ocean's pulse so thoroughly they could sense land before it touched the horizon. These weren't just feats of navigation, they were acts of faith in the power of human curiosity. Yet for all their brilliance, these explorers walked a knife's edge. One misread current, one cloudy night without stars, and ships vanished without a trace. The sea kept its secrets well, swallowing whole fleets like Kublai Khan's Armada or the nameless ghost ships of Brittany. What's haunting is how much knowledge was lost, sunstones forgotten, wind roses buried, oral traditions silenced by time. The fragments that survived, portolan charts, astrolabes, camels, are whispers from a world where every journey was a brush with the impossible. And here's the twist, these primitive methods built the modern world. The cross staff evolved into the sextant, portolan charts birthed Mercator's globe. Even today, pilots use celestial navigation as a backup when GPS fails. The medieval navigator's greatest legacy wasn't just reaching new lands, it was proving that the unknown could be tamed with patience, observation, and a willingness to learn from every culture under the sun. Their tools were humble, but their vision was cosmic. So what other secrets lie buried in the past? What forgotten techniques might still hold wisdom for our high-tech age? Share your thoughts below, because history's greatest discoveries often begin with a simple question, just like those whispered on the decks of ships centuries ago, sailing toward horizons they dared to believe were